It's very good to see you guys.
Yeah, how was the trip?
It was magnificent.
Oh, wonderful.
Deeper than words, and I'm grateful to be back, but it was an adventure.
Was it an odyssey?
It was an odyssey. Yeah. It was the part of it was like the core experience was this trip was the reason, the excuse to go. We'll call it the excuse to go, because several years ago I had a discussion with Hashem where I told him, even if it's not reasonable for me to live in Israel right now, I need to spend more time there. So he finds all sorts of reasons to get me there. So the excuse to go there was a trip. It's called Momentum. And originally, this project began as a woman's project. The idea was it would be something like a birthright for women, a bit older. And the idea was to focus on a connection to Israel and Judaism, and then the women would come back motivated, and they would impact their families, and their families would then impact their community, etc. So I think that began like in 2009, something like that. It was wildly successful program. At some point, the women made it clear they want their husbands to go on something like it. And so about, I don't know how many years ago, about 8 years ago, the men's program started. And so the way I got involved with it is that there was somebody in our community, Chava Avner, who had led several women's groups. And I ended up, for the last year and a half, I've been teaching some of those women. I have a class on Wednesdays with some of those women. And so some of their husbands wanted to go on a trip. And so that's how I got involved. And so the idea was that a place like Northbrook would sponsor a trip, and you'd bring guys to Israel, and then there were guys coming from other cities. So it would end up being a large trip of a few hundred men all together. And it was supposed, this one was supposed to have 200 men on it. But after that last Iranian salvo, the organization gave people a chance to back out if they didn't want to go. So there were only 75 men altogether. My group started with 10, and only 5 ended up going to Israel. And so that was like a week. I was there for 2 weeks. I was there for a few days before, a few days after, to spend time with Shauli and his family. And I have 2 brothers who live there, to see some friends. But the core of it was this this trip, and which is extremely well managed and designed. But since October 7th, they've incorporated October 7th related things. So there was a day in the south where we went to kibbutzim that were overrun by Arabs. We went to Nova, to where that festival was. And so there was that kind of stuff at the beginning and at the end. And then in between, there were things like going to Masada, or the old city, davening Friday night at the hotel and that kind of thing. I was forced to slum it out at the King David Hotel. That was an accident. We were supposed to stay at a different Dan hotel, but they were doing construction. So we ended up at the King David for a week. So it was hard, but I figured out.
You suffered through.
I suffered through it. And yeah, so it was, there were many, many moments, some of them planned and designed and some of them not planned and designed on that trip, that I would call them deeper than words. So I will share one of those that for me, I can only talk around it, but we're close enough that you can sort of get the unspoken stuff. But we were at Kfar Aza, which is one of the kibbutzim that's overrun. I've never been to the concentration camps in Europe, and so I can't compare it to them, but as best I can guess, this was like that. You're going to a kibbutz. We had an army spokesman who was a guide who had guided like hundreds of these tours. And essentially, they're taking you from house to house, talking about the families, talking about what happened to them. On a kibbutz like Kfar Aza, nobody owns a house. The whole kibbutz owns the houses where the families are staying. So, like when the army comes in, they don't know who these people are. They just are going from house to house trying to liberate them. And the Arabs were in that kibbutz for days, not just hours. They were in that kibbutz for days. And the army is like fighting house to house to liberate it. And so they don't really know who these people are. They just know they found 4 bodies in this place and they found 3 bodies. So they spray paint on the outside of the house how many bodies they found and what day they liberated the house. That's so you're going from house to house, and that's what you're seeing. Some of the houses are completely burnt. And again, the spokesman who was sort of like a guide, is telling you about who those people were. And, there were some who were burnt alive. There were some who were blown up by hand grenades. There were some that were shot. There's stories about little kids. And the youth village, which is where they really came in, primarily did their damage in the youth village part of it. And so it's just horrific. And they even have a house that you can walk into. I didn't choose to do that by then. I was so sickened by everything. I didn't want to go in, but people were walking into the house to see the carnage. And so during the talk, the guide was taking us through. She mentions that the synagogue was untouched. So I had this initial thought that lasted a millisecond, which is, wow, that's cool. The synagogue was untouched. And then after that millisecond, I'm, looking at a house where everybody was burnt alive. And at that moment, I realized I don't have a vessel that can hold these two things. It's not insignificant that the synagogue was untouched. I don't know. I just don't know what it means when right next to their there was a family burned to death. So also, this is not a particularly religious kibbutz, and so a lot of the people were away because it was, it was like Simchas Torah. So a lot of the people were just away. There wasn't really a lot of celebrating going on inside the kibbutz for Simchas Torah. So a lot of people were just away, either vacationing or with family or whatever. Right next to this kibbutz is a religious kibbutz called Kibbutz Saad. And the terrorists tried to get into Kibbutz Saad, but they couldn't get in. And so, again, you have this religious kibbutz that ended up being saved because I guess somehow the security at the entrance was really tight because they had a lot of people there because they were celebrating the holiday, and so they couldn't get in. And my heart for a second flutters and go, wow, a religious kibbutz was saved. But it was clear that is a piece of information for which there's no place to attach it. It didn't make anything better to know that. It didn't make anything make more sense to know that. It was just like a piece of data. And so that was just one few seconds of that day. And it went to this deep, 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 deep place. We went to Kfar Aza, then we went to Sderot, which is a city that is constantly been under rocket fire for the past 20 years, but was overrun, and the police station was surrounded, and there was a gun battle, and there was all sorts of terrible stories. And then we went to the Nova grounds where the Nova Festival was, and survivor people that were there and were talking to us, etc. And then we ended up at this kibbutz called Alumim, which is a religious kibbutz right near there that was overrun, by Arabs. And we had dinner with the people from the kibbutz. So it was us and people from the kibbutz. And at the end of dinner, we just broke into singing and dancing. So here you are singing and dancing with these people. And the words of the songs are like, thank you, Hashem, and God is King, Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach. And you would think it was the most inappropriate moment. And somehow it wasn't. Somehow it was a perfect end to a day that had all these competing things and paradoxical things that were going on. And it was, again, coming from the deepest of the deep places. And yeah, then the next day we went to Yad Vashem. I don't know. So those first couple of days were like that. And then
David said for a few laughs.
yeah, for a few laughs.
Right.
So yeah. So, and obviously and then like you're davening at the kotel on Friday night and all these other things, and everything was just so deep. And a lot of these guys who I'm also looking at it through the eyes of the guys that are there. There were a group of Israelis that were part of the trip, and they were there for themselves in order to have because they also wanted the sort of inspiration of the trip and getting to meet Americans and things like that. And for Americans to be able to actually meet and become friends with Israelis. So they're on there. Every one of these men was either just in Lebanon or just in Gaza, and had all their own stories to tell. But like one night, so let's say the trip that day ended at 6 p.m. We all went out, and when I say we, the Chicago guys and the Israelis went out to Machane Yehuda. We went to a restaurant, and we're eating. We had a few beers, and everybody's just talking and schmoozing and having a great time. And I'm just looking around, and these guys are not young. Like, there was a guy from that group who just they didn't even know it. The people on the tour didn't know it until we got to Nova, and he was one of the first people at Nova while the stuff was going on, trying to save people. And it was, he had just horrific, mind-boggling stuff. And there he was. We're just schmoozing and having a beer. He's 49. Some of those guys were 50 and 51, still fighting, not just, in support roles. They're still like fighting. And some of them, they're fighting and their kids are fighting. And it was just mind-boggling. And it was also one of these moments. It was an unplanned kind of moment that was so wonderful and so deep. And then we'd come back to the King David, and our beds were turned down. Chocolates were over there.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
were there any incidents around where you were or where you were when you were there at all?
No, when we were
Sirens?
no, when we were in Gaza, when we were at these kibbutzim, which are like they're just like a couple kilometers from Gaza. Like you look over and you see Gaza's right there. So you could hear blasts, but they were the army blowing things up. And you also heard gunfire. I mean, you heard a lot of gunfire and blasts, but it's mostly the Israelis doing it. It wasn't anything from there. While we were there, like right before I got in, right before I got in, like a day or two before the rest of my guys, the night they got into Ben Gurion, they didn't know it, but the airport had been closed for half an hour right before they arrived because of missiles that had come in. But they had no clue about it. They were told afterwards. I was with them. They were told afterwards by somebody, "Did you know that the airport had been closed like a half an hour before?" But they didn't know it, and there were no there were no incidents that we knew of. The last day we were at this place called Shura, 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 which is an army base in the south, and we didn't know why we're going there. We were told just to go there. I mean, that we're about to have an experience we're not going to forget, but we didn't know why. So you show up, and the first thing you notice is these buildings that on the outside they say that they are the rabbanut of the army. So they're the armies. There's a rabbinic corps connected to the army, and this was where the main buildings were for the rabbinic corps. So, but we still don't have any idea where we're going. And then we get there, and there's a guy who greets us, and he tells us his story. His story was that he works for Worldwide Mizrahi in some capacity. He lives, I think, in Rehovot, which is near there. And on October 7th, he was told to show up at this base. He wasn't told why. And he explained that he was in the rabbinate, in the Army's rabbinic corps when he was serving, but this is a couple years after he was serving. And so, and he said, like, his main work was cleaning kitchens for Pesach, or, it wasn't like anything dangerous. He said his brothers would laugh. They said, when we say the tefillah to protect the soldiers, we're thinking about you not getting paper cuts or something like that, because he never, during his entire service, was ever near anything dangerous. So now he's told to go to this base, and when he gets there, he's told he's going to be in charge of the Chevra Kadisha, that this base is the Chevra Kadisha for the army, and which means that they handle the bodies and prepare them for burial. So usually it's just for soldiers. Initially, all the bodies from the south were coming to this base. And he said that these trucks started to show up, and these trucks were chocolate milk trucks. In Israel, the chocolate milk's called shoko. So they were shoko trucks. And, they're painted all like children's colors and stuff. And they say chocolate milk on the outside. And then they pull up to the area where they do the handle the bodies. And then you open up the truck, and it's completely full of bodies till you couldn't fit another one in. And then another truck comes, and another truck comes, and another truck comes. And so he said that, they're coming in body bags, and you have to take them out of and then, they have to process the bodies. They have to find out who this was, first of all. And then they have to process the body like you would at a funeral home for a tahara. You wash the body, and etc. And that the condition of the bodies, etc. There were many of his the people he was in charge of were vomiting on the side. There were people that couldn't take it, and they just quit because of the condition of the bodies and everything that was happening. And so there's one person in charge of the men, and then there's a woman in charge of the women. And this woman, I've been told that she has come to the States maybe once or twice to speak about what's going on. I've never been next to somebody who had the depth of spirit of that woman. Both of them made the point that their number one job is to honor the dead, kavod hamet, but what that means in the process and the experience and how they find the strength to keep on going, it was just the deepest of the deep, and the concern for the dignity of each person. Like, one of the points that both of them made was that if somebody, according to the Gemara and the Medrash, if somebody is killed for Kiddush Hashem, which means primarily that they're killed because they're Jewish, that their status is that they are the holiest a human being can be. There is holier than the most righteous person. They are the whole, and so, as they handle each person, that is their attitude, that this is the holiest human being. Didn't matter if they were, what their life was like before, if they were at Nova, which is a rock concert on Simchas Torah, doesn't matter. They are now the holiest of the holy. And it was just so deep. That was the last day. So there were a couple things, the first couple days, and then the last day, and then the rest of it was things like the old city and Masada on the Dead Sea, and there was a lot. There was a good amount of spiritual stuff, but it was just calmingly spiritual. It wasn't hard hitting or anything. It was just very appropriate. And but there was a day of learning where we studied together and stuff, but everything about it was done gently and beautifully. So that was that. Okay, let's learn some Torah.
Quite an experience.
Yeah. Part of it is managed. It's like a managed experience. It's like a wedding. You plan for a wedding, and it's a very managed experience, except somehow there's joy, like it's, and the people that are experiencing it experience it as a kind of unique joy, even though every second of it is planned.
Yeah.
Because it seems funny because these trips are planned, and there's guides, and there's, now you're going from this to this. Why are you going from this one to that one? Because it makes sense for this reason and that reason. But it doesn't matter that it was planned. It still was so heartfelt and soulful.
Yep.
Rabbi, Birthright is sponsored by certain groups. Is that like the same?
Well,
group?
it started I think it started, I don't know where the initial funding came from. I don't know if they thought it would get as big as it did right away. So I don't know how much funding it needed to get off the ground. So the Israeli government gives money just like they do to Birthright. And then there are private donors. So I don't know, initially who was funding it, but now there's a broad array of funding. But the Israeli government, I think, is the main source of money for it. But they're always like, because they're getting funding from like trusts and things like that. So there's all sorts of paperwork required. So along the way, they have to document so many different things to comply with the funding requirements. So you see a little bit of it. It didn't really infringe on the experience. But if you're stepping back and watching it, which sometimes I was, from an organizational standpoint, you get a sense that a good amount of it is coming from philanthropies, not just grassroots donations. But I know there are grassroots donations, but so they need, like, not only documenting the experience while it's happening, but they're also, they sat us down in a room to do the review, and it was done in such a way to make sure everybody reviewed the trip. Like if you left the review to after people went home, you might only get 50% of the people that are reviewing it. They didn't leave it to that. The last day they had us in a room and doing the review, and the reviews were extensive. Like, what did you think about this part of the program? What did you think about that part of the program? What did you think about this part of the program? So that suggested to me that a lot of it's coming from like philanthropies and trusts besides the government. It's millions of dollars. I mean, in order to do it, I had to raise money. I had to raise about $10,000. And it would have been more, but I only had 5 people that went in the end, because I was supposed to go with 10 and only 5 went. So like for each person that goes, the local sponsoring organization, which is me, had to give $1,000 per participant. The participants themselves give about $1,700. That's besides their flight. They also pay for their flight and any spending money. So it works out that if you're a participant on this trip, by the time you finish with your spending money, buying gifts for people and stuff like that, it's between $4,500 and $5,000 out of pocket for a participant. And then for me, I had to, pay for them. Plus I have to pay for my own flight, my own expenses around the flight. It's like getting back and forth to Jerusalem and all those other things. So for me, it was also around $5,000. So by the time I was finished, I had to raise about 10. If 10 guys would have gone, it would have cost me about 15. Those guys are paying their amount. But then, Momentum, I'm trying to guess how much they paid per person, but I'm assuming they're also paying about $5,000 per person. Now, usually they're having about 200 men on one of these trips. So each trip is costing them like $1 million. And then they're doing, I think that the average year they do 6 trips, because they do women and men's trips. So they do about 6 trips. So if I'm guessing $1 million, I'm sure it's more. And so it's not cheap. It's a lot of bang for their buck, for the Israeli government, because it's a high profile, and the people are going back very motivated and are self-selecting, sort of, that they are likely to be people that are part of a community, so that when they go back, there's you'd think that this is a high impact as far as bang for your buck kind of programming. So, but I don't know how much Israel gives towards it. At one point, we had the Israeli ambassador elect. He was not yet confirmed. He's now been confirmed. Okay, I think his name is Leiter. He spoke to us on a Saturday night. So that would be the Israeli ambassador to the United States. There was also a guy who spoke to us who specialized in training people to respond in conversations about Israel. So how do you respond, or how are you proactive in conversations about Israel? But it wasn't the main focus of the trip to turn everybody into spokespeople. But even if you sort of left it like it was, and then there's expected follow-up by locally. So somebody hosted Friday night dinner this last Friday night, and I walked over to their house. And so the notion is you're going to create a bond with your group, and that's supposed to continue, and it will, with our group, continue forward. So there is a built-in follow-up mechanism for it. So it looks to be a smart program, even for Israel. It looks like a smart program for them to be sponsoring. But it's a religious. It started like the woman who's most associated with starting it. Her name is Lori Palatnik. She and her husband were an Aish couple years ago. They're no longer technically associated with Asia Torah, but there were a lot of it's got a religious core. So and there is study. There are other religious elements that are purposefully there as part of it, but it's not heavy. It's like, that's why I was calling it gentle. I actually the guy who was the tour leader, usually there's like one figurehead tour leader for the entire group. So this guy does a lot of the trips. His name is Saul Blinkoff. He's like an animator for Disney. I would call him like a sort of Tony Robbins kind of figure, like very motivational. But he himself, at one point, he wasn't a religious guy, became a religious guy through Asia Torah. His connection, he still has a connection to Asia Torah. There were Chabad guys who led a couple of the groups that came. It wasn't just an Asia Torah thing, but Asia Torah, their model for like a graduate going out into the world is more closely to a motivational speaker than they are to a rabbi. Like Or Sameach was more, they wanted to produce scholars, Talmidei Chachamim.
Mhm.
Asia Torah, began as a mission to impact the Jewish people. And so their prototypical kind of graduate is more like in the motivational speaker kind of thing, which for this kind of group really worked. So they're mindful of the spiritual side of it and make sure there's people that are that have developed a spiritual curriculum for it and there's people mindful of kind of spiritual moments. There was like a Karlbach kind of sensitivity, that kind of singing and that kind of vibe that was a part of everything that happened, which was so natural for everybody in the group. We even had a Reform rabbi in his community that was part of the group, and you could tell they were very comfortable being there. It didn't feel like it was a Kiruv centric kind of thing. But even the spiritual stuff was very moving to me. I decided I'm going to be a full participant. I went to all the classes, no matter who was teaching them, and there was always something to get out of them. So, all right, we got to look at the Sefaria page, which was a big success, I think. A lot of people would have never gotten that. I think I get credit for showing the Sefaria homepage, even though we didn't get to it.
And there it is.
Tomorrow, I'm feeling like tomorrow we're going to get to some actual text. I'm thinking it, but it really is great. You need to read Tolkien if you don't know the reference to Bilbo Baggins coming back to the Shire. There is an Odyssey element to it, as many of them have it, but I don't think Homer is enough to understand the experience entirely. Okay,